Hey everyone and welcome back. Today we're going to do a tutorial for the Godot engine. Now I highly recommend you take a look at my Godot engine review video. It's kind of a high level first impression of how it might be different from Unreal or Unity or GameMaker, whatever it is that you might be used to using. The main selling points, if you've never even heard of it, are that it's free and open source, super lightweight, snappy, and it has a very different kind of development style with scenes and nodes in this tree hierarchy structure. And we'll go more into how that's similar and different, good, bad, I don't know. But first, this is the same demo from that video. It's a little bit modified. I'll play the demo. We'll go through the gameplay features that we're going to learn how to make. Now, this is not a complete game. This is more to show you the logic and kind of the framework you can use, especially for dialogue and triggering events. So let's just get right to it. First, we have a player, and we can move them around, and you can see first that they have smooth movement. We can go diagonal and in circles. I'm using the WASD keys, but we have the logic where we could use maybe even a joystick. And you see we have a red brick over here, and we have another red brick over here. These are just my placeholders for items. You can see I am using placeholder graphics up the wazoo. Art and animation will be a totally different video. Today is just logic and scripting. So we're moving our guy around, and he finds this brick. So we say it's a brick, and yep, it's definitely a brick. So now we want to go to the brick a second time, and it says something different. Nothing's changed here, it's still a brick. I have better things to do. So that right there is an event. We remembered somewhere down the line that we had already seen the brick, so we're going to play new dialogue. Now here we have the professor. He still asks us questions about how old we are and all that. You can see we have different options, or we can just press the next button for him to keep talking, and he'll say different things, maybe depending on what we choose. So that's another thing, branching dialogue with player options and remembering what the player chose. Now let's take a look at this. So we have a wall with a collider. We can't get through it. We also have this door. We can't get through it, so let's examine the door. So it's locked. We need an invitation to get in. Now you'll notice in this output down here, I printed some stuff just for bookkeeping, no purpose to the game, what we're interacting with currently, and then see in brackets it says item. Right now, if anything's of an item group, which right now are all of the red brick looking things, all of those are just items that you can pick up, they'll be added to your inventory. And right now I don't have a graphical way to access my inventory, so I'm just printing it out every time there's a change to it. So logically it's there. Like I said, this video is about scripting today, not the pretty quality of life user experience stuff, just how to make something. So over here, whoa, this is our invitation. Who would have thought? We received an invitation to the party. So if you look down here, sorry if it's small, it says item, which was our brick, and then we have the invitation in our inventory. So let's try this door again. And we unlock the door. All right, so now this collider was turned off before. We couldn't get through, now we can. So logically speaking, once again, once this event was triggered, and we have proof it was triggered because now we can get through, whereas before we could not, it would just be trivial to then say trigger door open animation, so that this right here maybe goes, ow, and we have like a door open sound. You can add all those things. It's trivial once you get to that event, what you want to do once that event happens, in my opinion. All right, so those are the main things. Once again, basic player movement, attaching sprites and colliders, interacting with items and people, choosing, branching dialogue, and then having different dialogue events pop up depending on your choices. And then having different events trigger also depending on your choices or inventory. So that's a lot there, but I do think that it does give a good base for doing a ton of different types of games, at least my favorite genres of games. You could do RPG or like a visual novel or an adventure game. I don't know, whatever you want to do. But let's start with the player. So here's our game. This is our parent root node, and we have our player here. So let's take a look at what makes up our player. We have a kinematic body, and this is where these nodes that are named, they're pretty much empty. You'll see we don't have any scripts attached to them. There's really no properties to take care of. This is kind of just for my accounting purposes, that everything that falls under here is owned by player. So the main thing that's actually giving functionality is this kinematic body. You see, this is where we manage the position, the scale, and so on. And this is where we've also attached our player script. So in here, we extend the node that we want to affect. And you'll see this later. It extends node. Later on, we have items that extend from a generic item class, and so on. So we extend from a kinematic body. We've set a speed that works pretty well for us, and then an initialized movement vector. The target, this will be the thing that we're interacting with. This will all come together as I explain. Just absorb it. Don't worry if you're not understanding everything right off the bat. And then we have our empty inventory. And we manage two bools with the player. First, we have can move, and this is only set to false. The player cannot move when they're in a dialogue event. We don't want you just going off the map while you're strangely talking to the professor who's 100 miles away. So we set can move to false when you trigger a dialogue event so that you're locked in there until you click out of their thing and it's over. Then we have can interact. This is set to true when we go in someone's zone where when we press E, we either talk to them or examine the object. So in this case, we're using these area 2D colliders. You can see if we zoom out, the professor has a blue area, the brick does, this door does, and the invitation does. Now these are different from the static colliders. So let's take a look at our invitation, for example. We have this area 2D marked by this blue square. So let's zoom in on this. And then a static body, which is actually defined by the collision shape, which is pretty much the brick itself. We can't pass through this small area, but can interact. Our ability to have something happen when we press E or the action button, that's triggered by this blue area, whether we cross paths with this. And we can freely move through here. We just can't move through there. So that's what this bool is handling. And just to show you really quick, now that we're talking about that, that's what we do. You see this game root node? You can click on this little scroll to go to its script. And we have this function ready. This is in player. You can add it to any script you want. It's basically your init function, whatever you want to initialize. And here we're going to get the player node, and we're going to get all the interactables in the scene. So what's an interactable? This is where we can assign items to groups. So for example, here we have the invitation. We can click invitation and then node and then our groups. And we see it's a part of the interactable group and the item group. These are just custom names I made to help manage things. Any item or character is an interactable. And then items are also items. So items are things you pick up. Interactables are anything that does a thing when you press the E key, in this case. So here we grab all the interactables, the professor, the invitation, the brick, the door, and we get their area 2D node. Now this is where you'll notice the way we access the actual objects is through this get node function. And you'll see later on it's very much like almost the command line, like going through a directory. You can only get nodes that are below you unless you kind of go like .. / until you get to the root node, and then you can go back down. We'll see that in a sec. Actually, I'll just show you now because what the hell. Player, see right here, .. / dialog parser. That's because the player, the actual kinematic body that the script is attached to, is here. We need to go one out, and then one out, and then we can grab this one. Hopefully that makes sense. That's how we have to grab nodes in this case. Let's go back to this though. So we grab the area 2D node of every single interactable, every single object that's of the group interactable. And then we connect its body enter function with this custom function that we have in the player script. So what does this mean? This is really useful, by the way, and it's important, I think. So we can go to, let's say we click on area 2D under the invitation, and then we click signals. These are all predefined, like already implemented functions. We don't have to decide like at what point does the player, at what point, like what is the actual collision algorithm to decide when the player like sets off a flag because they were in there. All of that is done for you. You can just connect your custom code to do different things when, for example, a body enters this blue area. In this case, the player is the body. It enters the blue area. What should we do now? Well, what we should do, the function that we've connected it to, this onArea2D body enter. So all this is doing, all our custom code is doing, is making sure that the body that entered the area 2D, the blue interactable area, is the player. And if it is the player, then we can set our interact flag to true. It means we can trigger an action or a dialogue event or something like that. And that the target that we're looking at and interacting with is that particular object. And similarly, if we exit that blue area, we don't want to trigger any dialogue events, and we don't want any target that we're holding on to. So we set those to false and null. So that's what that's the basic flow of how we interact with things. We connect our custom code when we enter in there, we trigger the custom code, and then when we exit, we trigger the custom code. And we decide what dialogue event to choose based on this dialogue parser, which I'll get to, but we needed to grab the target from here. Really, the purpose of this is to decide if we're in the collider, and then secondly, to grab the actual object, to grab the node and all that information so that we can decide what dialogue to choose, where in our files, what should we parse, all that, which we'll get to that. But that's the purpose of that custom code. All right, so let's go to our init function for the player. These are just predefined functions, once again, for Godot, where we want to be able to read input, and then we also want to be able to have this update function, fixed process. So this is also predefined. You can see the underscore fixed process. Delta, meaning I'm assuming like the change, like delta frame by frame. And it's really simple in our case. If the player can move, once again, if they're not in some dialogue event where they're locked in place, then we're going to move the player. So what does that do? It's basically that we have a unit vector, and depending on what keys we press on the keyboard, right now it's WASD. If you want to be a good person, a good programmer, whatever, you should probably have like up, down, left, right, generic key bindings in case you wanted to map it to like a Xbox controller or what have you. But we add on to our unit vector and normalize it, and that's how we're able to get that smooth movement. So once again, it's a pretty simple function just to get moving. But the meat of this is in the event and dialogue system. That's what I spent the most time on, and it's what I think is probably the most interesting in terms of learning how all the scripting works together. So this is another predefined function, underscore input event. And this is just going to check if there was any kind of input event, a click, a key, what have you. And this time we're just looking for the E key, which I did define as just a generic interact key. That's what I should have done down here, but I did not. The print doesn't matter for our cases, so we're going to ignore that. So if we can interact, we're in some object's blue area, and we press the E key, then we're going to call this to set a dialogue event off. And we're going to make sure we stay in place. We can't move. And if it's a object with an action, in this case, the door is actually the only game object with an action to it, we're going to call it. But because, here, let me just show you what the door does, because we have a generic item, and an item, let's see if I can, yeah, this is our generic item that extends a node. And it has an init, it has this update choices, which I'll show you guys in a sec, and you can choose to do an action. In this case, the door is the only one with an action. You can see if we find that the invitation is in the player's inventory, we just turn the collider off. And this is where we could add a door open animation, we could add a door open sound right here in this action. But so in the player input, we just say we're going to trigger the items action, or we're going to try to trigger an action. If it's not there, for example, the invitation doesn't have one, that's fine. And you see here how it inherits from the generic item.gd. And then here's the door script, also extending item.gd. This is in contrast to just extending the general node. item GD, the base class extends node. So hopefully you're kind of seeing how inheritance and things fit together. So let's go back to player. We try to trigger an action. If it's not there, that's fine. If it is, great. And then if it's an item, remember our groups that we had, the brick and let's see, go to groups, the brick and the invitation both had the same groups, interactable and item, whereas the professor, see, he's just an interactable. So if it's an item, we're going to append this to our inventory, which essentially means that we've picked it up. If we just added a graphical UI, we'd have all of the logic to just go for each item in our array of inventory, you know, display the icon, add a new button, whatever it is, however it is you want to organize your UI. But most of the meat happens in here, in our dialog parser. So let's take a look at that. And this one is a bit of a doozy, but we'll do our best. So let's go all the way down to our init. Now, if once again I was a good person, I would make this so that we could, you know, maybe put a level, specify something to decide which story files to load. In this case, this is just a test, so we're just going to load the test files. And we have a story test, events, and choices. So let's look at what those even are. First, this is our story file. This is where we're actually getting the resources and the text for our game. So for example, you can see this is where the professor's dialogue starts at this. This is the initial point where he starts. So let's scroll down to where that key is. Here we go. Hello there, young child. You'll see when it has a link path, and I'll go through this more in detail. That means that there are two different options that we can choose, and these options route to different keys. Or we have this divert, which is when we just press the next button and he keeps talking and we go to the next dialogue block. So this is where we keep all that logic, whether to just press next, whether to do branching dialogue. We have this isEnd flag here when it's the end of the block, and we quit out of the dialogue event and we can move around freely. And this is where we can also record other kinds of metadata as well. I want to show you guys how I managed to generate the giant kind of narrative story file in such a nicely formatted way with all the link paths and diversion. So this is Inkle Studios' Inkle Writer tool. It's completely free and it's awesome, and they made interactive fiction games like 80 Days and Sorcery! And I'm a really big fan of them. They have a really nice visual tool for dealing with, you know, branching stories of all kinds, and you can even visualize what your branches look like. They can get even crazier than this. You can see how everything branches out and then goes back to one end point and so on. And the cool thing about this is super easy. You can click share and then you have this URL, and if you just type .json, so let's make a new tab and go over here, you'll get the full JSON output. So this is what I did, and then I just modified it a bit and added some stuff by hand. You can easily format this. I'm using Visual Studio Code. You can easily get little plugins that'll make it clean and pretty, or like browser options or whatever you want to use. And just to prove how easy it is to just add new dialogue, let's go over to the brick. Let's see, item initial is what I have for the first time we take a look at the brick. And let's say I wanted to add something. Now, it's better probably to use a tool, or it's probably pretty simple to write your own Python script or something to format your dialogue in the way you want. The tool I showed you guys is just convenient for its visuals. If you were going to write more, though, I definitely don't recommend doing it by hand like this, but we can just say, ha ha ha, this is for the tutorial, and then smiley face. Okay, so that's what we want it to say. This is just when we check the brick, we're just adding on a new dialogue block. And so this will be our new end. So we need to make sure this is set to isEnd, whereas this one needs to divert to number 2. You'll notice Inkle Studios or Inkle Writer will use the first few letters as the key. In this case, I just chose to use indexed numbers. So we have item initial here, item found here. So let's take a look and make sure that it changed. All right, so we're going to examine the brick. There should be a third block. So it's a brick. Yep, definitely a brick. Ha ha ha, this is for the tutorials. That's how easy it was to just add a totally different box. Like I said, everything is dynamic. But then where we decide the logic of which one of these dialog blocks we should choose, we have choices.json and events.json. Let's actually go to events first. So this is for scene 1. When we look at the door, for example, we have a start. So this is the first thing we say when we look at the door, which was like, oh, we need an invitation. So we start off and our door initial is false, meaning we haven't seen it yet. And as soon as we check the door for the first time, this will be marked to true. Similarly, let's go down here, for example. This item was the little brick we found. So when we found it for the first time, this flag was marked to true. We saw that that was marked to true, so we decided, okay, let's try to do the repeat option. What does it say the second time we check it? And you'll see a lot of these have this start and repeat flags because those are kind of the default states. Either you have the first time you look at something, sometimes there will be a lengthier explanation. Like when you think of a, I don't know, Final Fantasy game, you talk to someone, they talk like many paragraphs, and then the second time you talk to them, they have like a one dialogue blurb. That's what I'm talking about here. Start, and then the second time you talk to them. And then you have these other conditions, like angry. If you looked at the brick, he'll randomly get angry, if you remember from my other video. Or if you're at the door, if we have an invitation, if this flag is satisfied, then we can trigger this event. So that's how this is working. If the flag is set to true, or if this custom flag is set to true, then we can trigger this event. And the way I have it structured is such that it will always trigger special events like angry before it triggers start or repeat. So in this case, it would trigger angry, and then it would trigger start, and then once you did start, it would trigger repeat. And so we'll take a look at this. But these custom flags are stored in choices. So we can keep storing choices. We could store the choices that we made here. You can see, let's go down to when we have a link path. So yeah, here we get to choose different things. And we could record which option we chose from one of these flags. And we could add on, you know, chose boy, chose girl, chose neither. And maybe that would dictate the if statements for if people call you he versus she or something like that. All right, so those are the files we're working with. That's what we load straight away. And here we see again the connecting functions. In this case, we have a button on the panel. If you remember when we were going through the dialogue, we had several buttons on our gray dialog box. This is where we set the panel. This is where we set the custom code for the button. So when the button is pressed, this is a predefined function. We're going to trigger our custom code, which I'll show you guys. So let's take a look at this first init function. This is the entry point for every single dialog event. We go through and first we initialize some variables, and then we update our choices. So if you remember in our generic item script, we have this update choices function. This was the action, like when we unlock the door. This updates our choices if picking up an item or interacting with something caused a choice. For example, this is where we got the choices file. Remember here where we have the have invitation flag? This is where we actually decide to set that flag to true. So let's go back to the dialog parser. So right away, the first thing we do when we trigger a dialog event is see if there's any of those flags that we need to update. In this case, we're updating the invitation flag. And then we're going to choose the dialog branch that we want to display because different things could affect that based on prior choices affecting this current event. So first, we're going to look up all possible branches. You see it calls lookup event. All that does is it looks up the events file. Just to remind you, it was this one. So it looks up the event. Let's say we're interacting with the door, and it would get the start and unlock events in a list. So we return all those, and then we want to choose the dialog. So we're going to first look if there's one that is not the start or repeat. Those are just the default kind of values. If there's one like unlock, for example, which was over here, if there's a special one, then we're going to bias towards that first, because that probably means we satisfied some condition beyond the default that we want to trigger. So if we return a special one, then we're just going to return that branch first. Otherwise, we'll do the start flag. If the start flag is false, that means we haven't even seen the initial default, so let's go through that. Otherwise, we're just going to do the repeat, like the little summary blurb they give you when you talk to them a second time. And otherwise, if none of those conditions were true, and maybe we add more conditions later on, we're just going to default back to the start. All right, so we've chosen our dialog branch. This means that we've chosen the flow that we want to go on. For example, whether the door announces it's unlocked, whether the professor goes down one set of branches and trees or another. So let's go all the way back down here, back to the Innit dialog. So we have our dialog branch that we want to choose. But now we have to have the logic for the UI. So for example, see down here, we're making sure that we have dialog to show. And then we have these divert, link path, and we have all these bools. Okay, what do these mean? So you'll notice in our dialog, like the professor, for example, let's go back to the professor. There's like these link path choices. This is when we're able to choose different options. And then there are these divert options. This is when we just press the next button and he just keeps going on and on. Or else there's just an is-end flag. There's no divert or link path. So depending on whether we just want to press the next button and go to the next block, or whether we want to show the different buttons with the different potential options, we're going to have to handle the UI logic differently. So there's three cases here. First, it's a divert where you just press next, it goes to the next one. The second case is where it is a choice dialog and it is a choice. So this is just kind of stuff I've defined in my head. A choice path is when you're given two different options and then you have to link to the next dialog depending on which option you chose. So that's what these bools handle. If is choice is true and is choice dialog is false, that means you have just chosen an answer and we're trying to route you to the right place, whether that's another divert, another dialog option. Whereas if these are both true, that means you're selecting the different buttons. Hopefully that makes sense. It's a little confusing, but there are three cases we need to handle, and I'm using these two bools to manage that. So let's go to the get next dialog. So this is where when the button is pressed, when the next button or your answer button or what have you is pressed, if it's the end, we're just going to make the panel disappear. Otherwise, we're going to clear the previous choices if there were any, and we're going to set the next dialog. So this is where we're handling this redirecting to these different cases. So here we check if there is that is end flag. If there is, then we're just going to say the player can move, the panel's hidden, you know, you're free to go, the dialog event is over. If we're not at the end block, then we're going to go through and we're going to check what is the link type. Is it a divert? If that's the case, then we're going to go, you see if we have a divert, we have this key here to another dialog option. So let's go find it. Here it is. So you can see it's highlighted. This is the key. We're going to grab this content right here. See this highlighted? This is the content that's going to be the text that we put in our box. So that's just what we're doing here, and that's easy enough. We just say our current dialog is this, and then if you look through the code some more, I won't go into all the UI details because a lot of that is just very mechanical. That's just the text that we're gonna feed into our label. Easy enough. If we want to show the player the different options, if it's a link path, and it's a choice dialog meaning we have different dialog boxes, then we're going to call this get choices, which all that's really doing, let's see, where did it go? It's up here. Sorry for the lack of organization a bit. We're just going to go through and we're going to get all of the possible link path options, append them to a list, and then we're going to dynamically create buttons based off of that. But for now, we're just going to get the choices, and we're going to pipe the choice text into each of the buttons that we dynamically create. Finally, if we have just clicked on a custom button and we're choosing an option, then we want to get routed to the right place. So we need to choose what button did the user pick, what was its index, was it button 0, button 1, button 2, and then we're going to go find that button's key that it was associated with, and then we're going to route you to the next option that you needed to go to. So that's what this is doing here. And then we call this set choice values. And this is where we're managing, like, where are we going to? Because we could go from a divert to a divert, a choice dialog link path to another choice dialog link path, a not choice dialog link path. Like, there's so many different combinations. We need to make sure these bools are set so that the next value keeps going in the correct cycle, and we're creating the right UI elements for whatever the next dialog block is going to be. So just for a little bit on the UI stuff, over here, this is where you can see, I showed you guys the panel earlier. This is where we just add buttons and we assign a name and an index to it, add them as a child. And the one thing I'd really like to do here, though, is have either some kind of scroll option, so we could have like 20 different buttons, or dynamically resize them to fit the box so that we could have like 10 options or something like that. We set the text from this cur choices that we made up here in get choices. You know, we went over here and we grabbed this link path block, this link path block, and we took these option tags, and this is what's going inside of each of those buttons. Okay, just to wrap up and review, we know how to add unit vectors together and normalize them to make smooth movement. We know how to attach sprites and different components to nodes to make different things happen. We know that we can enter an object's area 2D to interact with it. We know that how to make objects say different things depending on situations, whether it was the first time we looked at it, the second time we looked at it, or if we satisfy some condition that triggers a different action than it otherwise would behave. We're able to pick up items in our inventory and have those items affect, you know, the door or other items and characters. And we're able to have branching dialogue and then save those choices or have dialogue be affected by different choices that we make. So all in all, I hope this was a helpful tutorial is showing you how to interface scripting with the UI and game objects. Let me know if you like these Godot tutorials. I could do more, maybe with animation and sound and managing assets more than just my placeholder, beautiful placeholder MS Paint artwork and the default logo as every character. Anyway, let me know if you'd like to see more of these tutorials or whatever other topics you'd like to see. But most importantly, have a happy day wherever you are. I'll see you guys soon. Bye!